I've got 15 minutes to build up for the panel that's about to follow, and I realize Bernard Millet, the former chief executive of SACEM, is here. And Bernard always taught me to speak in threes, to always make 3 points. So Bernard, here are my 3 points for everyone here. I am going to first talk about the global value of music copyright, a subject close to everyone in here's hearts. Then I'm going to turn to the question of music and cinema, and how music has overtaken the value of the box office cinema industry. Something that you would have been laughed at had you said that pre-pandemic is true today. And lastly, especially given who's going to be on stage after me, I want to look at how music reflects culture. So I'm conscious of people still coming in, but I will proceed and hopefully you can hear me fine. The global value of copyright. It is not enough for us to talk about our industry referring to the, quotes, IFPI yearbook and saying that the music industry is a $30 billion business, because that's not even us. That's record labels and artists. And 10 years ago, I was very passionate about making sure we understood what this C with a circle around it, copyright, was worth. And to do that, I set upon an exercise to add it up. Essentially to add together the IFPI Global Music Report for the labels and the artists. On top of that, CISAC, who we were here with today, their Global Collections Report. Then to add into that a value of music publishing, such as sync rights and grand rights, value of copyright that goes outside of the collective management organization. Finally, to do lots and lots of mathematical adjustments. There's double counting, there's add backs, there's pan-European licensing to consider. And then that allows me, after about 2 months of eating cold pizza and drinking flat Coca-Cola, to come up for air with a final figure and present the global value of copyright. That's the technical way that we get to this figure, and there's a bit of history to recapture as well. It's the 10th year I've done this exercise. The first time I did it, you can see it's $25 billion, and as you go from left to right, you can see not just does the number get bigger, but the media coverage gets bigger and bigger as well. In this edition, I was on the front page of the Financial Times with the copyright valued at $41.5 billion. So more and more people are getting interested in this subject. Take a look at how banks are buying music catalogs, for example. So let's quickly turn to where we got to for 2024, the most recent edition. And the big figure to hold on to here is $47.2 billion. Let me just repeat that. If you're engaging with policymakers around the world, you quote 47.2 billion. It's the biggest figure we have. It's going to have the biggest impact we can make. But what makes up that 47.2 billion? Well, 29 billion goes to the record labels and their artists. $13.6 billion goes to the songwriter CMOs, you folks. And on top of that, you've got 4.6 billion going to publishers directly. That's an interesting figure because it's almost doubled in a decade. And I want to turn to that very briefly, because Music Business Worldwide was set up in December 2015. I'm sure you all read it to this day. And the first edition of it, Tim Ingham, the editor, asked me, can you put a value on copyright? And I came up with 25 billion. Now we're close to 50 billion. And that raises a very interesting question to discuss over dinner tonight. That is, we've gone from 25 billion to 50 billion in a decade. What's going to happen in the next decade? Am I going to come in front of CISAC and say it's 100 billion? And how is that new 50 billion going to be different from the old 50 billion? The emerging markets of Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia. Or, a pessimistic scenario, we reach streaming saturation point and the market fails to grow. That's a really good talking point, and I've given you the evidence base for that conversation. Leave that there and go to something a bit more technical, and it applies to this room, which is fair division. When you look at the value of copyright, all of it, you can ask who gets what share, how much goes down the path of the record label and the artist, and how much goes down to the path of the CMO, publisher, and songwriter. And I just want to make a quick observation about how the value of copyright is split. It's not 50-50, we know that, but in some sectors, one party wins, in another sector, the other party wins. For example, is it fair that when Spotify pays a record label $1, they pay the publisher about 30 cents? Honestly, that's not fair. It's not 50-50. But then what's the rationale, the economic reasoning for it to be done like that? Equally, if we look at business revenues, is it fair that when BBC Radio pays out, they pay the songwriter for Radio 2 around £90, and they pay the artist only £60? Well, that's not 50-50 either. I don't see the PRS saying to PPL, let's just make it 75 each. So fairness is an abstract concept. If you're going to argue for more, you have to argue somebody else deserves less. And what you can do with my work is understand who's getting what share of copyright. It's the only way you can do this. And just very quickly, back in 2014, before streaming had taken off, it was a $25 billion business, and it was split pretty much 50-50. But as consumer revenues, streaming grew, you can see the scales have tipped in favor of labels and artists and against publishers and songwriters. Now it's 62% of the labels, 38% of the publishers. Now, how do you want to interpret that? Well, it's tricky because on one side, publishers are making 60% more in revenue. On the other side, their share is down 14%. I'm not arguing for better or for worse here, I'm just giving you the facts so you can understand how you might want to form your arguments. But there's another application of fair division before I close out here, which is to understand that topic of AI. Take a look at these headlines here. Cobalt. Cobalt's AI deal will soon rival 11 Dabs guarantees publishing, quotes, parity with the record labels. They're asking for 50-50. Sweden, Stim, who are here in this room, they've actually got their first license up and running for licensing AI music. And Coda in Denmark are suing Suno over training. 3 headlines which tell you that this room, this audience, is moving first, not last, when it comes to engaging with this new technology. I think that's a super crucial point. Typically, record labels move first, publishers and collecting societies move second. These headlines suggest that at least on this side of the Atlantic, it's you guys, the members of CISAC, that are moving first, labels moving second as well. That's the first of the 3 points I want to cover. A $47.2 billion business, split in favor of labels over publishers, but with this new format of AI, which the panel will discuss shortly, to work out, well, what is going to be the breakdown? How much should the collecting societies be aiming for when you license AI music? Should you want to license AI music? Second thing I wanted to cover is box office. It's interesting for me how the cinema industry often dominates the political discourse. We talked about lobbying this morning, how the MPA in America will have the ear of senators and Congress folks when it comes to the value of copyright. Often in music is David and cinema is the Goliath in that relationship. And had I argued before the pandemic that music could overtake cinema, everyone in this room would laugh me off stage. It's not going to happen, Will. You've taken a stupid pill. That's interesting because nobody is laughing now. If you take a look at the pandemic, on the left we have box office, on the right we have music, and post-pandemic 2024, we can see that pre-pandemic $42 billion went to the box office, over $31.5 billion went to music. So that means the eyes were bigger than the ears. In a relatively short space of time, have a look at what's happened since. Now cinema has shrunk to $30 billion, and music has grown to $47.2 billion. The ears are now bigger than the eyes. I don't think we champion this enough in our industry. It's a very, very relevant point. Now, this room will be thinking, what about this? What about that? What about isms? Why has that happened? Well, it's happened for a lot of reasons. A big one is the role of Netflix, Disney+, what we call SVOD, video on demand streaming. And if you take a look at what's happened to that market, and I just want to focus on 2 years here, what you can see is that pre-pandemic, the video streamers were roughly speaking the same size as the cinema industry, 41.6, 41.9. Look at the years that have followed and we go out to 2025. Now you're in a business of video streaming being 4 times the size of cinema. And where I want to take this presentation is to the first rule I learned 20 years ago when I moved to London to work as chief economist of the PRS. I want you to think about why this matters. What's the now what, so what when we stay on our sofas and watch Netflix as opposed to going out to watch the cinema? What does that mean to our business of copyright? Well, I'll argue, and lawyers, composers may want to argue against this, but I would argue that in the video streaming world, they're needing more rights. They need performing, mechanical, and they need sync licenses as well. I'd also argue that the video streamers pay higher tariffs than they do with cinema. And if there's Americans in this room, we all know how much cinema pays ASCAP and BMI, a big fat zero. And also, we've got more customers choosing to stay on the sofa and subscribe to Netflix, fewer customers choosing to go to the silver screen. Now, when I moved to London 20 years ago, I learned about something called the hierarchy of exploitation. Complicated. What that means is the more you engage with the intellectual property, the higher its unit's value. That meaning the less linear, the more interactive, the less lean back, the more engaged you are with the content, the higher the value of that copyright that is licensed. And my point being, before you even wake up in the morning, if the consumer is choosing to stay on the sofa as opposed to go to the cinema, the value of this copyright increases. And this applies to music, to audio video, to visual arts, that key point which should, in theory, apply. The more the interaction, the more the engagement, the higher the unit value. That's at least the economic interpretation as well. So I think that's a big positive takeaway. The way that consumers are behaving with content grows the value of the copyright industry. The last point I wanted to make before handing over to the panel, I think all of these topics provide bridges for the panel to discuss, is to discuss how music reflects culture. There's a word that's become my middle name in the past 3 years called localization, which I will teach in one simple slide. The whole world is discussing this, and if you buy The Economist on Friday, I've got a double-page feature explaining this. Why is it that on global streaming platforms, artists, songwriters, creators would rather be a big fish in a small pool, a large local act speaking in their local mother tongue, than a small fish in a big pool? I'll pick 2 countries, large and small. Let's start with Denmark, population 6 million. Why is the Danish charts on streaming, global streaming platforms, dominated by Danish artists performing in Danish? It doesn't make sense. The world is supposed to be flat, but they are choosing to perform in their local mother tongue and be over here as opposed to lost over there. That's a small country. The other country that the whole world is trying to understand right now is Brazil. If you go to the YouTube top 100 artists in Brazil today, you will find no English language and no Spanish language artists at all. No Olivia Rodrigo, no Taylor Swift, no Karol G. In fact, the only international artist there is BTS, ranked at number 78. So why is Brazil a top 7 music market? Brazil, by the way, is just overtaking Canada and South Korea to become the 7th biggest market in the world. Why is Brazil saying thank you and good night to the English language and thank you and good night to the Spanish language too? That's localization. We could talk about that all day and night, but I just wanted to close out with one final observation, and it's relevant to who is going to be joining us on stage shortly. Let's leave Denmark. Let's leave Brazil. Let's go to Canada and look at the changing face of Canada today. What I find music so interesting is our data that we produce in our business is a microcosm of so much more in the world. And if I was to say to you that the most streamed language in Canada today is English, you would say, "Go, Will, tell us something we don't know." Of course it's going to be English. But does anyone want to guess what number 2 is right now? It's very interesting to look at the data to reflect society. The second most streamed language in Canada today is not French, and it's not Spanish, it's Punjabi. And these Punjabi artists, A.P. Dillon, Karan Aujla, Shub, these artists are doing incredibly well in Canada. They're doing even better in India, and the data reflects how Canadian society has changed. And I should also stress that we now have a Punjabi artist who has just sold out Wembley Stadium in London, 85,000 seats, in 24 hours. And I didn't even know who this artist was. So Bernard Millet always said, make your point in 3. If I close out and hand you over to your panel, let me just recap on what we've discussed here. Firstly, you now have the global value of copyright. The C with a circle around it is $47.2 billion. When you speak to your prime ministers, your presidents, that's the number to use. And you can now ask, will that double in the next decade? If we all came back to Paris in 10 years' time, am I going to be saying it's a $100 billion business? Second, that point about consumer choice. The more you interact with intellectual property, the higher the unit value. That should be in your licensing structures. That should be passed on down to the creators who made the content. And thirdly, a point I'm passionate about is that, remember, this business that we work in is just a microcosm for so much more. Undervalued, I agree, but disproportionately the impact it has cannot be overshadowed by anything else. It's huge, huge. So with that, thank you very much for the invitation to come to CISAC, and I welcome you to your panel. Thank you very much.